Welcome to the Laughter Clinic podcast with comedian and suicidologist Mark McConville, bringing you practical, evidence-based self-care strategies, the latest research in mental health, along with conversations that inspire, educate, and entertain. This is the Laughter Clinic podcast with your host, Mark McConville.
Hey my friends, welcome to this episode of the Laughter Clinic. Hope you've all been well wherever you are in the world, and thank you very much for tuning in. You've just got me this week, just me by myself, and because I've actually got a few things that I want to chat about in relation to this week's topic, right? And this is something that's been sitting with me for a little while now, and I was tossing up whether I'd have guests in to talk about this, but no, I'm going to tackle it myself. And so this week's topic is to watch the news or to not watch the news, right? To stay informed with what's going on in the world or to not be informed as to what's going on. That is the question, because surely I can't be the only person that thinks about this sort of stuff, how much news that we should and shouldn't be watching. So now I want to share with you a reason. There's a reason why this has become a podcast episode, right? So recently I was at a social gathering with some friends of mine, and they were, this group of guys, they were all talking about what was happening in the news, right? They were talking about global stuff and local stuff here in Australia. And, I've known these guys for a long time, and it was interesting that I stood there and I was listening to the conversation, and I had nothing to contribute. I couldn't contribute in the conversation because, not that I didn't care what they were talking about, but because I genuinely wasn't informed enough to make any, meaningful contribution to this conversation, because I wasn't aware of the news stories that they were talking about. And I got to tell you, it was interesting because at that moment I was kind of standing on the periphery watching this conversation happen in front of me, thinking to myself, wow, I actually feel a little bit disconnected to these guys that I usually feel connected to, and, a little bit isolated at the time. And, they were like, oh, you're pretty quiet. And one of them said, oh, he doesn't watch the news. And so we had that conversation. But it really made me think about, whether or not me not watching the news and wearing it as a badge of honor kind of thing is a good thing, because it's been something that I've been proud of. I talk to everybody about not watching the news and minimizing your news input and that sort of stuff. And because, we all know it's so negative, there's so much negative news, and I'm just like, I don't want that shit in my brain. And, when doing mental health presentations and laughter clinics, I talk about minimizing the amount of news that you watch. So it is something that I've talked about for a few years now. But, it's one of those things that, depending on what's going on, like during COVID, I was, glued to the television like everybody else, finding out what the hell's going on. So, but anyway, so this is what we're going to unpack today, right? To watch the news or to not watch the news, right? To be informed or to not be informed. So this encounter with my mates made me think of sort of three. I approached it from three things that it kind of brought up for me. Firstly, it was I was thinking to myself about how effective I can be in relation to supporting people's mental health. Right, because it made me question, like, can I be as effective as possible in supporting people's mental health and talking about things that they're going through if I'm unaware of what it is that's worrying them, right, and what's making them feel sad and what's making them feel angry or frustrated or things that are in the news that are keeping them up at night, basically all of the things that are affecting their mental health, so it made me kind of look at it from that aspect, right? How can I effectively support and empathise with these people if I'm blissfully unaware of what's going on? And along the same vein, it kind of made me think, does this lack of awareness of what's happening in the news and all this sort of stuff negatively impact my ability to actually form meaningful connection with people? whether it's with my mates, the other night, or whether it's with, people when I'm doing a mental health presentation. And so, yeah, that connectedness made me kind of look at that as well. And another thing that I kind of thought about was in relation to do we have a civic duty to be informed? Is it are we responsible citizens if we're not informed as to what's happening in our country or what's happening on the global stage? Is it being irresponsible to be ill-informed, or so that's, it's like I said, it's complex. These are all the sort of things that I want to unpack, right? And so the conversation in particular that my mates were having at the time, right? Like I said, social gathering, we just, I don't even know how it came up in conversation, right? They started talking about what's going on in Gaza and Iran and Israel and all that sort of, and the protests, right, that are surrounding all of that sort of stuff, and what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. And, obviously I'm kind of aware of what's happening, on the surface, right? But I do not have any information or details as facts. I just have the headlines, right, myself. And, they're talking about, obviously, at the time, like I said, it was a couple of weeks ago, and the United States going into Venezuela, these ICE shootings that are happening over there, and then the conversation shifted to kind of closer to home, what's happening here in Australia about we've got these hate speech laws that are coming into effect, and gun buybacks and immigration, which was a big topic of conversation, because it seems to be a global conversation. And then at the same time, we're talking about the strange climate that the Australia has. Like one half of the country is on fire and the other half of the country is experiencing floods. It's incredible. And then obviously, this is in southeast Queensland, and of course the conversation also brought up youth crime and home invasions that are happening here on the Gold Coast and that sort of stuff. And so they're covering a lot of things. And like I said, I didn't really have anything to contribute. I was just kind of listening on the outside, and I realised that I'm blissfully ignorant as to what is going on. And I felt, I did feel a disconnect to these mates of mine, because I wasn't able to contribute. I wasn't able to empathise with them as to what it is, that all these things that are getting them anxious and getting them so fired up, so and maybe that's you. Maybe you get fired up about what's happening in the news, or you got people that that watch the news all the time and they get so fired up about it. So this is the kind of stuff that I want to unpack today, because like I said, surely I can't be the only person that has this conundrum as to, watching the news or not watching the news, and this balance, which is where I want to go at the end. I want to try and figure out how do we balance it out. So to watch the news or not watch the news, my friends, that's where we're going. So now, as I said, I'm a big fan of not watching the news. I do get my news in certain ways, right? Like there's, I'm a big fan of listening to the radio in the car. They have the news like usually on the hour. You only get a couple of minutes, and there's no visuals, which is cool. Social media, get news there. I have Google Alerts set up on my laptop where I get alerted but that's for, work, research, any research studies that happen around the world with mental health or suicide prevention, human laughter research. So it's obviously not the same as watching the news, right? So I get a bit, right, but I don't actually sit and watch like a half-hour news bulletin at night or read the paper or something like that. So very small idea of what's going on. But yeah, like I said, no facts. So what are the cases for staying informed? Well, firstly, like I said, being able to provide empathy for people who are experiencing anxiety about what's going on in the world, because it's hard. How can I empathise with people that are anxious about something that they've experiencing in the news or a massive news item if I'm unaware of what it is that they're anxious about? So, connecting with people and being able to empathise with them, I think, is a really big one for me, a case for staying informed, because, so many people are carrying around burdens and stress that you don't see on the surface, so I think having an understanding of what's happening in the news probably could lead me to being more empathetic in relation to, people's stresses, what they're going through. And like I said, do I have a civic responsibility to be informed? Because at the end of the day, democracy requires informed citizens, really. Because when we vote on something, you're voting for a government or you're voting for a referendum or something like this, you need to be informed as to what's going on. So if I'm not informed as to what's happening, does that mean I'm actually neglecting my responsibility to participate in a democratic society? So that's another case for watching the news and being informed, knowing how to vote on certain issues, or knowing what different political parties are standing for, and that sort of stuff, I think, is important. Case for being informed and what's going on. Another one is I thought, does it give me more credibility if I am talking to people about mental health, because I do mental health presentations, have this podcast, a laughter clinic, that sort of stuff. If I have a better understanding of what's happening in the news and the global, the zeitgeist basically of what's happening in the world, does that going to benefit my ability to talk to people about mental health conditions that, these news events might be triggering, because, news events do trigger mental health stuff, which we're gonna talk about very shortly. So, and connection, there's another argument for being informed and being able to contribute to conversations with people. Having a shared knowledge helps create connection about a certain issue, and obviously you've got to be mindful, right, of who you're talking to about what, because we all know, what do they say, a couple of topics of conversation. My dad used to say a couple of topics of conversation you don't talk about it at dinner parties, politics and religion, because they're so polarizing, right? People get so passionate about either one of them. So, you know in your tribe who you can talk about certain things about and who you can't. So, so it kind of hindered my ability to be able to connect with my mates. And then I did think about this. I don't know if privilege is the right word. It's a freedom, I suppose. The fact that I can actively avoid the news is in itself a freedom when you think about it, because the news for many people isn't something that they can avoid. It's their lived reality every single day. I can choose not to watch the news and not to watch what's happening in the Middle East and not watch what's happening with terrorism attacks and crime and all this sort of stuff. And that's a freedom that I have, like a luxury that I have. But for people that are living in countries or that war-torn countries or escaping persecution or whatever it is, they can't avoid the news. It's their lived reality every single day, So, it's one of those things that to have a bit of a better global outlook as to what's going on, I think is a positive thing, and understanding that it's a privilege or a freedom to be able to not watch the news, because to not be exposed to what's happening around the world, because a lot of people are living it. So when you take into account all those things, right, it seems, a pretty good argument for watching the news and staying informed, and being able to know what's going on, right? So that's that side of it, right? But now I'm going to try and balance it out by talking about things about not watching the news, right? The case against constant news consumption, because a lot of it's going to centre around the research in relation to the mental health implications of news consumption, right? Because there have been research studies out there that they talk about the relationship between increased exposure to negative news around anxiety and depression and stress. There was a lot of this done around COVID, right, when we were all glued to the news on a daily basis and find out what's going on. And I was the same, right? I was the same every day. You'd find out your updates and all that sort of stuff. So, but aside from, moving on from COVID, every day we have negative news events, right, that are going to affect people's mental health, like I was chatting to someone the other day about, I used to say about the fact that I'm already susceptible to anxiety and depression myself, right? So I don't want all that negative news stuff in my head. And I can't remember who I was talking to about it, but they said, you don't even have to be susceptible to stress or to anxiety and depression to be affected by the stuff that you hear in the news, because you turn on any news channel or, there's disasters, right? There's natural disasters happening, people being displaced from drought and floods, or thousands of animals losing their lives. You're being told about horrific acts of domestic violence, and then you've got the wars in different parts of the world, and conflicts and acts of terrorism, protests, political instability happening around the world, and how that affects everything. And if that's not enough, you're always going to get news of horrific deaths and crimes that have occurred, or people having accidents, and that doesn't even bring into account all the news around climate change and the debate around that. So it's constant exposure to negative events. Is going to have lead us to a heightened sense of stress and anxiety, because our human brain is wired to react to threats and news, to threats, that fight or flight response. And if you got it frequently, it can trigger a prolonged stress response, So, and we know the media has a bias to negative news. It's almost like the media exploits this evolutionary fight or flight response that we have, because the business model is like, if it bleeds, it leads. The more tragic the news event, the more horrific or negative it is, bang, it gets right up to the front of it's one of the front of the headlines. So they play on it. And another case for not watching the news is this helplessness that you can feel when you're constantly exposed to horrific events that you can't do anything about. You can't do anything about, you can't solve it. And so does knowing about the problems that you can't solve create a learned sense of helplessness is where I'm going with that. So, because you look at something horrific that's happening in the world and you're like, what am I supposed to do with this information? That there is a war on the other side of the world. Do I think it is a tragedy? Of course I do. Do I think it's horrific what's happening in certain parts of the world? Of course I do, but I can't do anything about it though. And so does that, it's a frustration. It's like, well, why do I need this information? These are all the things that have led up to me not watching the news. And it can be addictive, obviously when there's a big news thing happening, we're all constantly finding out what's going on. I know when, COVID, like I said, COVID, we're all getting our daily updates, and even more recently here in Australia, we had the horrific, the Bondi terrorism attack, which was a horrific event, and even then I found myself, I heard about it through social media, and then for the next week, every day I was kind of finding out what was going on, because I was interested in, the good news story of the hero, but then you've got obviously the tragedy of everything that happened. And so, you kind of have this fear of missing out. So you find yourself constantly checking for updates when there's a big news story. And at the end of the week, I was like, oh, fuck, what am I doing? Why am I doing? I'm going to stop watching this, And because here's a question, right? And I've been asking this of myself. So when I'm not watching the news on a regular basis, am I genuinely happier? There's a question for you. So when you're not watching the news, are you happier? And when you are watching the news, do you find yourself getting more distressed? Because it's a paradox. It really is. And that's the paradox that I've been sitting with that led me to wanting to do this episode, because staying informed and watching the news seems like the responsible and empathetic thing to do. But at the same time, constant news consumption is genuinely harmful to our mental health. So what do we do? How do we find a balance? Because that's what it is basically. It's going to be all about balance. So like I said, this is not coming from someone who's got all the answers and got it all figured out. I'm just trying to navigate this the best I can to try and, do what's right for myself and my own mental health, but also what is going to enable me to better connect with others, and be more empathetic to what people are going through. So, and it's because it's a strange time. Like I listen to a lot of podcasts, right? Okay. And so many podcasts talking about AI at the moment. And so just that in itself is another challenge when it comes to, to watch the news or not watch the news. Now you've got the AI implications of all this AI generated content. I heard this conversation occur recently. It wasn't with my group of mates from the other night that I'm referring to generally here, but I had another conversation where they were talking about, not being able to trust the news because they goes, is this deep fake news? Is it AI generated news? And, how do you even understand what's real anymore? Because you've got these algorithms that are showing us on our phones what we want to see. Like there's been so many times, I'm sure this has happened to everybody, where I might be having a conversation about car insurance or something like that, and then next thing you know, next time I'm on Facebook or some type of social media, all of these things come up with different car insurance things or whatever, or because I might be looking at one type of news article or something in relation to one political party, all of a sudden the algorithm will show me all these other things to do with that. So it's kind of, it's confirmation bias on steroids. It really is. So I suppose the question is, am I actually staying informed, or is what the algorithm showing me, what it just reinforcing my existing beliefs? Because there is so much happening all of the time. And this one mate of mine brought up this recently, which I thought was interesting. He said, this, and it's true, so much news is designed to trigger an emotional response, right? They say the easiest way to unite a society or a country is to give them a common enemy, right? And so news can be designed to trigger this emotional response of either outrage about something or engagement in a certain thing. And so, like my mate said, it makes you ask yourself, am I actually being informed or am I being manipulated, right? Which is, that's a fair call. That is a fair call. So especially when, we're going to get to the point where the AI is curating what news you see. So big questions, my friends. And like I said, I don't have the answers, but it's a topic that fascinates me because it's something that you can't avoid the news as much as, like I said, I don't watch it, but that doesn't mean I'm in total avoidance of it. Like you're still exposed, like something happens in the world, right? You're still going to find out what's going on. Like I didn't have to watch the news to find out about what was happening in Bondi. I don't have to be watching the news to know that some things are going on in Venezuela or, Ukraine and Russia, all that sort of stuff. You just find out what's going on through conversations and social media and all that sort of stuff. So the big question here is, how do we maintain our mental health while trying to navigate this information minefield? So a middle path, a balance is like, this is, like I said, something that I've been sitting with. So I'm going to experiment with this over the coming months for myself, just to see if I can find a sustainable way to stay aware of what's going on in the world without have a detrimental effect on my mental health. And I think one of the big things is I'm going to be checking in with myself to see whether or not I'm feeling overwhelmed by any of this sort of stuff. So I think to start with, what I'm going to do, the beauty is that we live in an age, we talk about AI and technology and stuff, but we actually live in an age now where you don't have to, sit and watch a half-hour news bulletin at the end of the day, like our parents did when we were kids. I remember it'd be, between 6 and 7 p.m. would be an hour of news and a current affair. You don't have to do that now. You can stream it anytime you want on your mobile device or, your smart phone or TV or whatever, so you can get it anytime, anywhere. So I'm going to give myself a 15-minute daily limit. Now, I'm not saying that I'm going to watch some type of news for 15 minutes every day, but when I do watch this, I'm in Australia, so I watch the ABC, and I friends of mine that work for the ABC and some journalists that work for the ABC. So, that's my primary news source. I don't watch the commercial news. I don't like the sensationalism that comes with a lot of the news attached by the commercial media. So the beautiful thing is that you can get on streaming, and usually they give you the headlines at the start of the episode. These are the things these are the news headlines for this episode. And like I've been doing this for the last week, and sometimes I might click on a news episode for Tuesday night or whatever, and I'll watch the headlines and go, right, there's nothing really in there that I need to concern myself with, and move on to the next one. And then just basically seeing, okay, so there's find a story that I go, okay, well, that's something interesting. I might find out a little bit more about that. And that's the beauty about streaming. You can, or the internet in general, basically, you can really have good control and agency over how much of this stuff that you watch. So I'm going to try and get a couple of different sources though. So, to try and balance it out, because aside from the ABC, we have another news source in Australia called Crikey, which is such an Australian saying, but it is a news source that's trusted by a lot of people, and you can get a certain amount of it free. You do have to pay a subscription if you want a certain extra content and that sort of stuff. So I suppose that's my attempt of trying to get some balanced views in the media in relation to news. You don't want to try and put all your eggs in one basket, and only if you want to try and have a balanced view of everything, the way that I look at it is you've got to try and balance out where you're getting your news sources from as well. So that's something that I'm going to try and find a way of working on, that quality over quantity balance. So, and one of the things that going to uni really highlighted for me is facts and evidence and all that sort of stuff. So if I can find news that, shows me evidence about certain things, well, that's obviously going to go to the top of the list as to things that I'm going to want to look at. So what works for you is basically, I'm so fascinated by this. So how do you do it, right? And do you have a protocol that you use where you go, this is what I do every day, I'll do this, or every day I do that? And do you ask yourself, do you ever ask yourself, does this information affect my life, or community directly? Do I need to know this? Is there any action that I can take based on this information? Or do you ever ask yourself, will knowing this information make me more empathetic or be more effective as a human being towards my fellow man? A lot of the times the answer is going to be no, I reckon, because so much of the news is just negative bullshit. So, and we talk about balance and negative bullshit. One of the other things that I think I'm going to try and do, I used to do this a long time ago, and now that I'm going to increase my exposure to news and trying to stay informed a little bit more, I'm going to try and find a balance. We're talking about balance about positive news content and negative news content and positive. So, as opposed to just, watching all negative news for like a week or whatever, however long, trying to balance it out and finding positive news stories, because they're out there, right? They're out there. There are places that you can go, websites and different, sources of media that will talk about positive news stories. So find one of those that works for you and try and balance it out, because the world isn't just bad news. There is so much good stuff happening in the world. There are a lot of people out there doing good things. And sometimes a negative news story can lead to a good thing happening, right? So I'll give you an example. 1994, I'm 24 years old, sitting on the couch, Saturday afternoon, and it was at a time where there were a lot of fires going through Sydney, northern Sydney, right? And destroying houses. It was a horrific thing, right, that was going on. And I remember sitting there watching this documentary thinking to myself, you know what? If that was occurring in my community and where I live, I'd like to think that I've got enough agency and enough nous to go out and be able to help people and do something that contributes to helping, right? And so on the back of that, I went and found my local SES, which is State Emergency Service that we have here. And it's a voluntary organisation. I signed up, joined up, did all my training, all that sort of stuff, and ended up being in the State Emergency Service for 5 years, fighting fires and doing forensic searches and searching for missing people and all sorts of things, tarping roofs when things went, when big storms went through and wiped out houses. Now, I'm not saying that to blow my own horn. What I'm doing is I'm saying it to say that if something happens that you see in the news, right, and you go, man, that's full on, it may drive you to volunteer to help people, or to donate $5 or $10 or whatever to a flood relief fund or something like that, because it gives you a sense of being able to actually do something, have something good and positive come out of being exposed to something horrible and negative, So turn anxiety into agency. Find, if someone's stressing you and you go, oh man, that's such a bad thing on the news, I can't believe those people are going through that. Is there a way that I can help them? Is there something that I can do that will, help them and helping someone else makes you feel good as well. So have a think about that. And have also a think about, this is, like I said, only suggestions. I don't have all the answers. I'm just trying to figure it out and have the balance so as we're informed citizens, but we're not fucking stressing ourselves out with shit news all the time. Designate news-free times of the day or news-free spaces, right? So I do remember growing up, and there was a time where you'd be sitting there having dinner and the news would be on in the background. And I'm like, I can't think of anything worse than trying to listen to the news or have the news on, having all this negative shit while you're trying to sit there and enjoy a nice meal with your family. Horrible. So, have a think about giving yourself some, setting boundaries basically is where I'm going with that on your news, and have conversations, with your friend. Like, once I get a little bit more informed as to all that stuff that my mates were talking about, I'm sure that our conversation is going to be different, because I'm going to be in a position to be able to contribute in some way and offer my point of view for what it's worth, and just being able to connect with and empathise as to the things that have been stressing them out. So, yeah, being able to discuss the news with your mates, your friends, it's kind of processing shit information together helps reduce anxiety. So, but obviously, be mindful. They say about that, don't talk about religion and politics at the dinner table. Or be mindful who you have what conversations with. You want to strengthen your friendships, not blow the shit out of them. Yeah, and I suppose it goes without saying, so many people talk about giving yourself a digital detox. Do the same with the news. If you've been watching it, I know for myself, if I start to feel myself getting a little bit overwhelmed in a couple of weeks' time because I've increased my exposure to the news and all the shit that's going on, I know that I'm going to be giving myself a detox from news events and go back to, not saying that I'll go back to not watching it at all, but, I give myself a week of going, no, I'm not having any of it this week. So it's all about, being mindful as to noticing how it makes you feel, how all this news makes you feel when you're watching it. Does it make you feel anxious? Does it make you feel stressed? Does it upset you? Does it make you feel depressed? And just being mindful of the fact that it may be having a negative impact on your mental health, and it may be time to adjust how much news that you're watching. So, because there has to be a way that we can stay informed without being consumed, there really is. So, like I said, that's going to be my plan is, 15 minutes a day. I'll still listen to the news and the radio in the car, and try and find something that's going to give me a bit of a summary of what's happening in the global landscape, news-wise, whether I do that once a week or once every couple of weeks. But, yeah, just trying to be a little bit more clued up as to what's going on there. And obviously, as I said, probably in about a month's time, give myself a real check-in with my own mental health and see whether it's been positive or negative, and whether it's like for me personally, but also whether or not it's been a positive thing with my ability to empathise and connect with people. So I want to monitor that aspect of it as well. So, there might be I dare say there probably will be a follow-up episode on this topic in a month or two's time to see how it's gone, and maybe I might have a guest that can come in and shed some light on this, because it's one of the reasons why this episode was a few days late in being done, because I ummed and ahed for so long as to whether or not I was going to get a guest on to talk about it, and I thought, you know what, no, I'm just gonna tackle this one myself for the time being, and later on I might get on a psychologist or a psychologist or a psychiatrist to have a chat about this stuff. So, yeah, there you go. And give myself permission to, change my mind if I want to in a couple of weeks' time and go, no, fuck the news, I'm not doing it. So, yeah, it's one of those things that finding what works for you, my friends, finding a sustainable way to stay connected to what's happening, to stay informed as to what's happening, to be engaged in the world around you, to be an informed member of your society, all while finding a way to do it and taking care of your mental health at the same time. So, yeah, so like I said, got a couple of questions. How do you navigate this? How do you stay informed without being overwhelmed? What strategies do you use? Or are you someone who is constantly watching the news and feeling stressed out about it, and this episode's made you think, yeah, well, you know what, maybe it does make me feel a bit overwhelmed. Maybe I do need to, pull back on how much news and that sort of stuff I'm letting into my life. So love to hear from you, my friends. Love to hear from you no matter where you're listening. So you can message via the Laughter Clinic website, send us a message there. You can comment on wherever it is you're listening to your podcast, or you can leave a message on the Laughter Clinic Facebook page, and just let us know what this episode's meant to you, and share it with a friend if you think it may be beneficial to someone you know, and just share your thoughts, because I'm genuinely interested in how we are all navigating this and trying to figure it out together. So let us know what's working for you or not, or what's not working for you, and how you've found ways to get through it. So yeah, there you go. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you've got something out of this episode. And as always, hit the subscribe button, follow, so you get notified of the apps when they come up. Share it with someone that you think might get something out of it. And, please, as always, be kind to yourself, be kind to those around you. Talk to you next time. Cheers.
Thank you for listening. The information contained in this podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes. It is not intended, nor should it ever replace, advice received from a physician or mental health professional. Want more info? Visit thelaughterclinic.com.au. If you enjoyed the episode, please share and subscribe. Thanks again for listening to the Laughter Clinic podcast with your host, Mark McConville.